The Europe entering into the 19th century had already been through enormous changes, yet at the highest levels it was still broadly recognizable. Most of Europe still had monarchies. The feudal estates still stood, commanding vast power and resources. Yet as Europe was becoming wealthier, its empires sprawling across the globe, so too was its financial sector increasing in prominence and sophistication. As the new merchant and banking class rose, power would move from the nobility to the merchant class. More and more, the most powerful men in these kingdoms were the bankers, and not the noblemen. Liberal philosophy was beginning to converge on the primacy of capital, the primacy of trade, and within the governing apparatuses, the primacy of ministers and bureaucrats. Europe was beginning to form into something else, and all the while brewing in the backdrop, more and more scrutiny was being placed on the role of the king. Monarchies were beginning to become threatened. The American Revolution of the 1770s had seen a very prominent British colony become independent and a democratic republic. Shortly thereafter, the French Revolution would take a much more radical approach to their crown, executing King Louis XVI via the guillotine. Back in Britain, Parliament was stripping more and more power away from the king. Until this point, though Parliament had risen in primacy, the British monarch retained enormous power. Yet during the reign of George III, many of these powers would be eliminated. King George would give up the power of his purse to Parliament, adopting the system of the civil list, whereby the Parliament would supply money to the king. The British Crown retained substantial lands and resources, yet now the king's spending was limited and subjugated to the government. Much of the monarchy's decline would be accelerated as King George would descend into madness. King George would begin to have outbursts, his emotions becoming wild and unpredictable, often descending into delusion. Doctors would be dispatched to aid in his malady, yet he seemed to be getting worse. As the king reached a point of incapacitation, his son, George, who had largely been thought of as frivolous and irresponsible, had to step up to act as regent. Under the regency, the monarchy would further decline. Much of Parliament and many of the lords had a deep distrust of George. He was likable, fashionable, he was stylish with an eye for aesthetics, fun and often charming, acting as a major driving force in British architecture. But he was wasteful, drunk, gluttonous, lustful, and often quite adolescent, and so the scrutiny was turned up on the monarchy. Distrust of the regent would even reach such a level that there was serious consideration of removing him from the funding of the civil list. The Parliament was seeking to take even more power. As the king was incapacitated and his son appeared unfit, the fire was fueled as Britain sought new ways to diminish the power of the monarch. Despite his malady, King George III lived a reasonably long lifetime, and so when the reign of George IV began, he was already in his late 50s, only truly king for 10 years. Upon his death, the crown would pass to his brother, William IV. Unlike the wild, gluttonous, and indulgent George, William was very responsible and conscientious. As a revolutionary attitude was beginning to boil up across Europe, the more pragmatic William saw which way the wind was blowing. He sought to protect the crown, not by fighting to entrench tradition, but by going along with the new liberal attitudes. Though originally opposed, he would ask the Whig, Earl Grey, to form a government in support of the Reform Bill, an act intended to vastly expand the voting electorate. The reform would face steep opposition, and in response, William would threaten to create a flood of new Whig peers to override the Tories in the House of Lords, forcing reform through. Ultimately, reform would pass, and the Great Reform Act of 1832 would be signed. This would grow the electorate by about 50%, opening up voting to the middle class. The reign of William IV would as well see enormous social changes. The Factory Act would see substantial limitations on child labor. The Poor Law Amendment would see the creation of a centralized system of union workhouses. He would as well support the expansion of religious toleration for non-Anglicans, reducing penalties on Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants. And though he was personally quite weary, when the Slavery Abolition Act would come up, he would not veto. This period often goes quite forgotten, with William not a particularly notable monarch, owing in great part to the short period of his reign. Yet this period around the 1830s would see some of the most significant momentum toward the modern liberal ethos. As he himself had no children, upon his death the crown would pass to his niece, Princess Alexandria Victoria of Kent, while the male-only succession laws of Hanover would pass the crown to his younger brother, Ernst Augustus. The Victorian period is particularly iconic. The images of the height of the British Empire, the bustling industrialized cities, the vast fleets of Royal Navy ships. There's quite a disconnect in how people think about this era, and in large part, that's because we don't quite have the language to contextualize what this period was. The modern notions of left and right really can't make sense of it. The Victorian Empire was commercial. The Victorian Empire was industrial. It was an empire of colony building. It was an empire of war. It was many things, and quite often, it was different things in different places and amongst different people. Many point to this empire and try to tell the story of some brutal, oppressive colonial overlord, of armies marching through foreign territories to control the land, while others point to the civilizing humanitarian mission, the building of infrastructure, the bringing of medicines and modern systems, of putting a stop to the cruelty in far-off civilizations. It was both of these things. Some of the empire was humanitarian missions. In some parts of the world, the empire brought prosperity. Yet in some parts, it made things worse. In some places, a nobleman might set up a business venture, in part improving the land around him, while in turn Anglican missionaries would come to join him, attempting to spread belief and humanitarian aid, while in other parts there was simply resource extraction. Take, for example, the Opium Empire in China, a merchant network which brought devastation to Chinese civilization. The empire was not one thing, it was a network. There really wasn't an empire. There were vast merchant and financial networks. Powerful businessmen and financiers, like the Rothschild bankers, would rise, financing vast projects and ventures across the world, becoming some of the wealthiest and most powerful men on the planet. This was the commercial empire, ultimately perhaps the most powerful one in the network. Yet there was also territory directly controlled by the crown. After the dissolution of the East India Company, the crown would take direct possession over India. Yet there were also personal projects of the remaining noblemen. There were networks of missionaries, and we began to see the building of what exists today. A vast network of relationships, influence, mutual interest, and obligation, all bound together by finance. This was the birth of the liberal empire. The driving ideology behind it, liberal imperialism. Liberal imperialism is a curious concept. Today, it's one of the most ubiquitous belief sets that exist, particularly amongst the Western elite. Yet to so many inculcated with the ideologies of the 20th century, it may seem to be a confusing topic. After all, wouldn't liberalism preach against imperialism? But in reality, the opposite is the case. Many viewed the role of the empire to be civilizing, bringing prosperity, and saving people from themselves. Many believed that unscrupulous rulers were abusing their people across the world, and that as Britain was more liberal and enlightened, it should put a stop to that, bringing liberal governance to all people. The blank slate idea increasingly became more prevalent, though in the 19th century, it didn't fully form into what it is today. Many believe that if liberalism, material prosperity, and Anglican belief were brought to a backward, brutal, and poor people, then they could be elevated to be much more like the enlightened, prosperous Britons. Similar ideas would emerge in the French Empire, on their part taking much more inspiration from the Napoleonic Code, and with a much more French Rousseauian flavor. An encapsulation of this ethos can be found in Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. The idea that the prosperous and enlightened Europeans, and particularly Britons, had a duty to civilize and bring up people across the world. Empire wasn't viewed as conquest. It was viewed as a means to liberation, and we will see as this goes forward that ethos never left, it just evolved. Today, the globalist vision is much the same, bringing the enlightened prosperity of the West to all people of the world. And if they don't like it, it's just because they don't understand. To many, this was an honestly held belief. It was viewed as humanitarian and a moral obligation. Yet simultaneously, in the merchant and financial empire, this was the perfect philosophical backdrop to build a global trade and banking system. The European continent of the mid-19th century was in large part held together by the 1815 Congress of Vienna. The Concert of Europe system had become frightened by what they had seen in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Many of the continental princes and noblemen wanted to return to 18th century systems, and so a balance of power was struck with a more conservative ethos, attempting to stabilize after so much turmoil. There was a delicate balance between the ideas of restoration and progress. Many looked at Europe's history and believed that its prosperity, its stability, its greatness had all come from its traditions and systems, that if the European nations wished to remain in such a great state, that they should hold on to what had made them that way. Others, meanwhile, believed that Europe should forge forward into the progress of tomorrow, that Europe should not be looking at the past, but attempting to push forward with even more of what was emerging, that it should become even more liberal, exploring deeper into these emerging ideas. This really is the tension that keeps societies together, that allows them to survive. Not necessarily European traditionalism versus liberal progressivism, but the drives to protect what has worked, protect what holds a society together, its bedrock foundation, and the drive to open up and do new things, to innovate. And at least for now, as Europe was entering into the 1840s, it appeared as though a balance had been struck. Much of Britain's ethos in the 1830s and 40s was a similar tension to that on the continent. The rising financial powers sought to displace the traditional nobility, and thus many of the traditional nobility sought to hold on to Britain's traditions and to preserve its structure. All the while, the middle class was rising, the monarchy and the peerage were declining, and there were increasing calls for democratization. Progress and tradition was the tension. Many new movements and ideologies within the liberal frame began to emerge at this point. Abolitionism would rise. The rather Anglican belief of universal human dignity would create inclinations of the brotherhood of man idea, and they came to believe that all peoples should be afforded a certain dignity. In turn, many becoming fierce opponents of practices of slavery, a position which would ultimately win out in Britain, creating a multi-generational project to end slavery globally, a project which some of their financial class were a bit softer on. Prototypal socialist ideas would begin to form around this time as well, and as the civilizing mission and the idea of bringing prosperity to all was at the core of the liberal imperial view, many of the ideas that would form into neoconservatism would begin as fledgling during this time. The strand at the core of this ideological movement is that in order to bring prosperity and liberalism to all, sometimes intervention and force must be applied. That military adventurism is not only justified, but required in order to spread the liberal world. This delicate balance would begin to break down, and by 1848, as revolutions would sprout up across Europe, many of the monarchies that had been silently accepting their decline began to become very afraid. There was a new jolt of terror. Many of Europe's monarchs began to wonder if they may be deposed, or worse. The situation was getting chaotic. There were multiple threads during this revolutionary period. One was the liberal, democratic, and often Republican thread. As industrialization had changed the living conditions of so many so vastly, the old social arrangements simply had not kept up. Many of the industrial working and middle classes wanted increased say in their nations. They wanted improved qualities of life. Many wanted a new social contract. Many of the rising financial elite were supportive of this movement, seeing this as an opportunity to not only reinforce the ideological backdrop that justified their businesses and elite status, but also as a mechanism to undermine the traditional nobilities and monarchies that were acting as a ceiling to their power. However, as many of the more lower-class movements became increasingly radical, these elite too began to become frightened. Very often, the liberal financial class is very supportive of sort of revolutionary working-class movements. For example, socialist movements. However, whenever they form into a truly radical movement that genuinely threatens the financial order, they will always quickly pivot, not wanting a true threat. There was, however, another strand. The industrial world had taken something away from people. It had taken away that traditional bond with the land, those close ties, that feeling of rootedness, and perhaps on a deeper level, the sense of magic in the world. The modern world that Europe had emerged into was brutal, mechanical. It sought to categorize everything and understand it with strict, cold rationality. And so as the 19th century went on, many sought a more romantic sense of the world, to return to something more enchanted. Romanticism would rise as a cultural and aesthetic form across Europe. Grand theater and music, artwork with deeper subtlety, conveying more sensitive emotions, and as well in turn, grandeur and epicness. Yet this romantic shift was not limited to art. In the social-political arena, it would begin to manifest as a new movement, nationalism. While the concept of the nation-state had been present since Westphalia, over the past centuries, most people still lived as they had. They lived in smaller villages, closely bound to their time, people, and place. Yet industrialization changed all that. Suddenly those who had been home, living on the land, the same land that had been occupied by their ancestors for generations, had found themselves cogs in a vast, impersonal machine. Many were seeking a more solid sense of identity. And so during this time, many began to coalesce around the idea of the nation. Nationalist movements would begin to emerge across Europe. People sought to bind themselves together and seek a sense of rootedness. A new burst of appreciation for traditions would emerge. The landscapes, the animals, those things that made their nation home. It was a burst in romantic appreciation for the nation, for their people, where they came from, and what bound them together. Many of the ideas that we have today of what a country is formed at this time. The 19th century would see the unifications of Germany and Italy, going from collections of many principalities, estates, and city-states, all with their own unique customs, traditions, languages, and senses of identity, and coalescing around one broader national identity. No longer were you from Anhalt or Saluzzo. You were a German or an Italian. All the same as the 19th century entered its latter half, the march of industrialization could not be stymied. While Romanticism brought some respite, the world was still becoming colder and more mechanical. The world that people now found themselves in was one of machines, cold logic, and the rationality of the Enlightenment. While this brought enormous mechanical advancement, prosperity, and wealth, it also took a certain spirit out of life. As the contemporary liberal ethos was aligning with the industrial world, it was becoming more materialistic. There would be a rise in secularism and atheism, and the ideas of the cold, mechanical world that had been forming for centuries increasingly became the reality for Europeans. The new belief was that the world could be understood through mechanical calculation, that the world was material. In 1859, Charles Darwin would publish On the Origin of Species. This new approach to thinking about the world's natural history, about the life on Earth, seemed to take away from the majesty of creation, saying instead that life developed through cold material processes. The publication of this book caused a substantial stir. To many, it was an attack directly at the heart of Christian belief, directly challenging the idea of divine creation. And in large part, this is a perfect microcosm of what was happening at the time. More and more people, whether publicly or privately, were becoming atheistic and materialistic. Many were coming to believe that the world could be understood through physical material sciences, and that if their civilizations were now being run by machines, perhaps the civilizations, perhaps humanity itself, were really just machines. So, as this more mechanical approach to human social systems was emerging, all while the liberal imperialist view believed that people should be brought up to the prosperity of the liberal ideal, it would naturally follow for many that perhaps society can be engineered to this end. Engineered like the machine it is. Many, particularly of Europe's elite, would begin applying industrial, material, and Darwinist ideas to society. They came to believe that they could engineer man, that if all the world was a machine, then the proper liberal thing to do would be to engineer it to the desired end. There was a new wave of utopian thinking that perhaps all humanity needed was the enlightened, level-headed thinking of the philosophical elite, an elite who could guide the people to a better world. This strain of thinking has emerged in different forms across all of history, yet in the modern liberal context it has had particularly disastrous consequences. The belief holds that human social systems can be understood rationally, that they can be thought of like an engineering problem, and therefore, the elite who understand it have the moral obligation to engineer society and people to the liberal utopia. Utopian thinking has emerged throughout time, yet the 19th century would particularly see quite a lot of it. There was an odd coalescing between the ideas of the elite and the working classes. It's not that they were aligned in their vision, but they were both pulling on liberal strands in different ways. Movements like the Chartists would emerge. This was a movement of working-class men who sought universal male suffrage, the ability for working-class men to enter into parliament, more frequent elections, and an overhaul to electoral constituencies, attempting to ensure that the working classes could be more represented in government. Working-class movements would pop up across Europe, yet at the same time more radical forms were being explored as well. In 1867, Karl Marx's Das Kapital would be published, and here we begin to see where even some of the working class ideas converge with elite liberal ideas, or at least how that was formed in later manifestations. The convergence that began to arise was on the strand of social engineering. This was really the crux of where liberal 19th century thinking was going. The more working class oriented, as well as the traditional communists, were decrying the unequal distribution of capital, or at least some degree of unfairness there within. This, of course, was antithetical to the commercial classes. Yet, amongst some of the more elite circles, an idea would begin to sprout. Hold on! The idea of an elite engineering all of society's resources? That sure sounds great for us, the elite! In 1884, the Fabian Society would form in Britain. As opposed to the radical socialists, those seeking revolution to overhaul society's relationships, they came to hold the gradualist view that society could be slowly engineered to their utopian vision. This would be the start of a very powerful strand within liberal thinking. This way of thinking has reverberated in globalism, in what's termed champagne socialism, in neoliberalism, in progressivism. Fabian thought was very fundamental to so many of the elite liberal movements that existed throughout all of the 20th and 21st centuries. In fact, Britain's Labour Party only exists because the Fabians were part of its foundation. While on the one hand you still had working-class socialists, those primarily concerned with increased representation of the working class, and the self-interest of getting themselves more wealth, Fabianism was a quite different flavor altogether. The heart of this liberal thought is, society is unfair. Somebody needs to guide the people to the fair, equitable utopia. Now, of course, the little people can't be trusted to do that themselves. So they need the guiding hand of the philosophic enlightened elite. We will lead them to the world of the international brotherhood of man, where there's no more unfairness, where all the resources are shared equally, where everyone is prosperous and free, and we are at the top, the stewards of the glorious golden future. This can be boiled down to, we should really have total control so we can make the impossible nowhere place, which is what utopia means. The latter 19th century was seeing the birth of a new liberalism. No longer was the focus around free markets, liberty, and the rights of man, but instead an idea was forming that the state must proactively help the people. The role of the state was no longer to be a sort of overseer, but instead should proactively be involved in the lives of the people. That same attitude that liberal imperialism had with respect to the rest of the world, that was now being mapped onto domestic societies. The liberal state should raise up the people. This melded perfectly with the utopian social engineering beliefs that were forming. Ideas from figures like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham would begin to proliferate. As society was trying to rationally engineer itself, it needed a way to quantify what its effect was. And so a new way of thinking would emerge, utilitarianism. The origins of utilitarianism were much older, with Bentham being active as far back as the latter 18th century. Yet the ideas of John Stuart Mill, a British politician in the mid-19th century, would substantially push along this way of thinking. There's something that on the surface level sounds intuitive about utilitarianism, that what should be pursued is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Yet what naturally follows is an attempt to calculate what the greatest good is. You end up in a situation where you're trying to apply a sort of numeric calculus to moral decision-making, and you can as well justify some pretty heinous things with, it's just the numbers. Just to use an example I've come up with right now, imagine that we could solve all the hunger in the world. There would be millions of people brought up to a much higher quality of life. Millions would be saved each year. But a few tens of thousands of people will have to be boiled into a soup and eaten. Would we really accept this as reasonable? There's a utilitarian argument for it. Well, so what if a few thousands of people are gonna get boiled into a soup? More people don't starve. The greatest good for the greatest number of people. You can see where this can really spiral into insanity. But if you're a utopian social engineer who believes that you are going to bring out the glorious end of history, end state where everything is perfect, well, you have just found an ideal tool. There was a corresponding development in economics, the marginal revolution, laying the foundation of modern neoclassical economics. An idea would emerge in economics as well. Utils, units of utility, an attempt to quantify how much goodness someone gets out of something. For example, if I have no ice cream and I buy one ice cream cone, I may have 100 units of utility. But when I buy a second ice cream cone, well, that doesn't make quite as much of a difference. Perhaps that's only 50 units of utility. Think about it for a moment. It's a useless attempt to try to quantify the unquantifiable. There is no math of happiness, and there's no math of morality. But in the latter 19th century, so many were hoping that we could find a rational, mathematical, engineering solution to all of humanity's problems. And here's something really troubling about utopian thinking. Because it justifies so much. After all, if you are creating the perfect end state where everything's perfect, absolutely anything ever is justified. It has a way of attracting the most cruel, narcissistic, wicked people. If you are bitter, resentful, if you hate people for their success, you are going to gravitate to a system that says, well, everything's clearly unfair. How about we sacrifice all of them? So what? It's a small price to pay for the perfect end state where all is well and all is fair. This is a pattern that has emerged forever in human history. And going back to our exploration of Christian philosophy, there's a reason that the story of Cain and Abel is the first thing that happens after the foundational story of Adam and Eve. What is the first thing that happens once there's a new generation of humans. One gets to work, is grateful, and tries to make things better, and the other resents his success and wants to tear him down. Well, that's been an eternal battle for humanity. And unfortunately, utopian, utilitarian, social engineering thinking is the exact justification for a sort of religion of Cain. Imagine that you're someone who's bitter and resentful, a sad loser. You look at someone who has a good life, who's doing well, who's loved by those around him, who's grateful. You look at him and say, why am I not like that? Why is life so unfair to me? And particularly if you're a narcissist, and you believe that actually all the good things should go to you because you're so much better, what are you going to tell yourself? You're going to tell yourself that the world just must be inherently unfair, and that you should design a better world, one that's fair, one where that guy has nothing and is dead. After all, you're brilliant and he's awful. He must have stolen everything he has. I'm the genius. I will make the world great. And so what? So what if I have to hurt him? It's a small price to pay for the perfect future. The future where there are no problems. And after all, since he clearly stole from me, he deserves to suffer. If the world just did what I said, everything would be good. So you know what the right thing to do is? You know what I have an obligation to do? It's not even what I want, it's what I have to do. I have to destroy those who wronged me. I have to burn him, so I can make the world perfect. That is Cain. There's a reason that's the first story we tell after Why Are We Here? Because that core fundamental resentfulness that justifies itself by saying, oh, I was wronged. Oh, well, if I were in charge, I'd make everything better. Oh, well, it's a small price to pay. That fundamental narcissistic resentfulness is the unending enemy that has tormented humanity forever. That is the eternal battle of all human societies. And unfortunately, liberal social engineering, utilitarianism, and Marxism became really popular amongst the elite, and are exactly justifications for that fundamentally flawed and cruel way of thinking. They talk themselves into justifying their own resentment, and that's why that's a problem. So where did that lead us? It led us to the horrors of the 20th century. It led us to gulags. It led us to famines, to camps. It led us to genocides and horrors. Because if you're making utopia, if you can justify that your resentment is righteous, and that really there's no price too big for what you're going to create, then you will become the most evil man on the planet. So why were the regimes of the 20th century so particularly brutal? Well, in large part because we came up with these ideas toward the end of the 19th century. As the Western world entered into the 20th century, there was a fundamental anxiety that had emerged into the populations. The field of psychology would emerge, attempting to find a rational and quantifiable method of analysis for human thought and feeling. Many of the Enlightenment ideas of people as rational actors became challenged. Particularly with these newer Darwinist ways of thinking, many began to wonder if really we were just animals deep down. If under the thin veneer of liberal society, what lurked beneath was brutal and animal. Many different ways of thinking would emerge from the rise of this field. Two very different directions can be embodied in Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Freud would focus heavily on this animal view, coming to believe that most human psychology can be understood through childhood development and the psychology of sexual reproduction. Meanwhile, Jung would take a much more metaphysical, rather alchemical, hermetic approach. He would focus on symbolism and the dreamlike world of the unconscious. something very curious was developing at the end of the 19th going into the early 20th century. There was both an increase in materialism and a revival of spiritualism. Particularly in Victorian Britain, many had become bored by the cold mechanical world that they lived in. Many began to seek out mediums, seances. They would be delighted by shows of phantasmagoria, where magicians would depict entities like spirits. Much of this was aesthetic and fun, trying to get a sense of magic and excitement back. But new occult movements would form, particularly prominent amongst the upper middle class, and there would be a quite curious joining of more political, often Fabian ideas, and new occult strands, particularly the internationalist thought of Theosophy. Theosophists would draw inspiration from religious and spiritual ideas across the world, believing that there was a deeper thread of spiritual truth hidden within all the religions of the world. One hidden true religion that all of the religions just have a little piece of. This lined up quite well with the rising internationalism and brotherhood of man. And so, a new idea would begin to form amongst the upper middle class and some of the elite. The prototypal form of globalism. If there is wisdom in all the world, if everyone has a little piece of the truth, if really everyone is the same, only made different by material constraints, by the cultures imposed on them, then really, the path to enlightenment is where we all become one people, where there are no more countries, no more borders. Imagine no religion. It's easy if you can. That's where it comes from. At least this modern form. Many of those who would be foundational to forming groups like the United Nations or UNESCO would come from these sorts of circles. A place where liberal imperialism, Fabianism, and new spiritualist strands like Theosophy came together. To many of these people, the international utopia was a religious belief. It still is. The idea is that it's a moral imperative, that humanity's future is to get rid of borders, to all become one. It's a lot older than the modern neoliberal era. And so traditional liberal esotericism, like that found amongst Masons, would begin to decline. Some smaller bodies would continue to exist, going off in their own directions, while some remained more as just social clubs. Meanwhile, much more Christian-oriented spiritual traditions, like the various Rosicrucian societies of Europe, would begin to either fall apart, or find themselves taken over by groups of theosophists or similar New Age occultists. What was rising was very internationalist. What was rising was utopian and socialist. What was rising was quite Fabian. Yet as Europe entered the 1910s, cracks began to form in these financial empires. Territorial disputes began to reach a point of crisis. The great power of the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, would decline. And in a world where people were beginning to think more internationally, more mechanically, more utilitarian, more coldly, a world that was now totally industrialized, off on the horizon was a war that would change everything.